So I was very pleased to be invited to this workshop, and then I was asked a few weeks ago, oh, maybe you could give a talk. Problem with Apple culture is that any sort of external talk literally takes months of approval, so that was out. But I thought I could maybe do something interesting rather than looking ahead, could look at the past. One of my claims, past lives, is I led the development of e-ink in the early days, the first 4 years of its existence, that big company down the road now in Billerica. And I thought there's some interesting lessons to be learned about taking technology out of MIT and getting it into the marketplace. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Continue to mirror. Okay, yes. Okay, so microencapsulated electrophoretic technology was actually invented at MIT in the Media Lab and spun off into spin-off company E-Ink in 1998. In less than 3 years, the technology went from basically this little piece of plastic that sort of did something to an actual active matrix high-resolution e-paper display. But it took another 6+ years beyond that for a successful product to be launched. And if you're a startup and you're spending a lot of money, waiting 6 years for a successful product is a very long time. And then things I want to point out is that several notable improbable inventions, leaps of faith, and some luck were really required for the company to be successful. So sorry for the small type for those of you in the back, probably going to have a hard time seeing it, but a quick primer on electrophoretic displays. So electrophoretic displays rely on the movement of charged particles in a dielectric fluid. And the first patent for electrophoretic coating was actually in 1907. In 1970, the electrophoretic display was invented and demonstrated in Japan by Ota, who was working at Matsushita at the time. And in that time period, there really weren't a lot of flat panel displays. So there was actually a big race on to figure out what was going to be the display technology of the future. Liquid crystals, electrophoretics, or electrochromic technologies. So companies like Matsushita, Xerox, Philips, Plessey, Epid, Thomson CSF, Seiko Epson, Exxon, and Copytel were all heavily investing in developing electrophoretic technology. But they lost to LCDs because LCDs could be passively addressed to get high pixel counts. You could not do that with the electrophoretics. Also, the electrophoretic had this annoying tendency is that the particles would settle over time, kind of get stuck, so you get image ghosting, and that problem was never really solved. So basically, the technology went into quiescence for the next decade. So I was approached by E-Ink to lead their technology. I decided to join. But before I went, I was asking people for some advice on what I should be thinking about in electrophoretic displays. And these are sort of the quotes I got. The battlefield of electronic display technology is littered with the bones of people who worked on electrophoretic displays. Okay, that was not encouraging. I met the head of, or sort of the father of the UK display industry, back when there was a UK display industry, Sir Cyril Hilsom, so he was knighted, at an event, and he asked me, oh, what field do you work in? And I said, well, I'm going to move to a startup to work on electrophoretic displays. And he said, oh, I'm so sorry. And then the last one, no engineer was ever fired for not introducing a new display technology, from a colleague at Motorola. So with that, so MIT and the E-Ink beginnings, so the microencapsulated electrophoretic dispersions were invented by Jacobson, who's a professor at the Media Lab, and then two of his undergraduate students, Comiskey and Albert, in 1997. So there's their photo in the upper right at the National Inventors Hall of Fame induction a few years ago. They had this very high-profile Nature paper in electrophoretic ink for all printed reflective electronic displays. And being at MIT, they were able to attract a lot of startup funding with the promise of, we're going to invent electronic paper, and then off we went. There was a problem in that that first technology was actually not very good. So the MIT microencapsulated EPD required 150 to 200 volts to turn on, not really practical for low voltage electronics. The contrast ratio was also really poor. And that was attributed to the fact that the particles were embedded in these microcapsules, which were pretty large and rigid. So you had a lot of dead space in between the microcapsules. So high voltage and low contrast. So one of the chemists at E-Ink invented, he had the insight that if you made flexible microcapsules so that you would coat these things down, they'd actually merge together and kind of flatten out. And you ended up with these beautiful images on right here, where you can see, very nice and uniform. We got it down to about 25 microns in size, so the voltage came down by a factor of 5. The contrast ratio doubled or more. Super flexible. So that was one of the key inventions, probably underappreciated, that were really necessary for E-Ink to be successful. Another one was the fact that the MIT invention, even though the paper had black and white particles, no one had actually ever got that to work. And the problem, if you think about it, if you've got negatively charged black particles, positively charged white particles, they kind of tend to stick together, and then that doesn't make a very good display. So we were focusing on single particles like titania in a dyed pigment, in a dyed dielectric fluid. But you can see in that upper graph to the right, basically you weren't able to get good brightness and good contrast. It was just kind of not present in the optics. So another chemist, Honeyman at E-Ink, figured out if I could graft the appropriate side chain polymers onto the particles' pigments, I could actually build in barriers to prevent them from agglomerating. And that actually worked. So this was the first practical demonstration of two-particle ink due to the chemist being able to adapt on these side chain polymers. Depletion flocculation, it's not a phrase you see every day, but it's also essential for the memory function of E-Ink. So it turns out that the early E-Ink panels were not really bistable, so over time the image would fade, you'd end up with some ghosting, and that really obviated the kind of the promise of a low power display. So another chemist, Rich Weber, had a colloid background, and he understood this concept of depletion flocculation. So if you take a high molecular weight, non-absorbing polymer and mix it in with these microparticles, what will happen is that through entropic effects, that when the particles stick together, there's a soft attractive force. So you'll get these soft flocks that could easily be broken up. So the graph on the right shows that basically you can put in different gray levels for the electrophoretics, and they last essentially forever. And you got some nice images on the bottom. So again, really unexpected but necessary invention that had to happen. Okay, so other inventions and the first products, so roll-to-roll coating of a microcapsule slurry. That was actually put on a roll with a release sheet. We had to transport that to the company that would actually be bonding it to the backplane. So we had to figure out how to do scalable lamination and interconnection. You had to edge seal it to keep it stable in the environment. Figure out how to generate accurate grayscale. And then there are other annoying effects like particles or charges moving in the polymer matrix would in fact induce these weird kickback effects so that the image would degrade. Anyway, all of these things were solved, so now we're able to make a display. Unfortunately, you have to address a display, and the first products we were only able to make were these large signs because where you could direct drive, so you basically ran a wire to the pixel, and then which limits the number of pixel counts you can have. So really, we needed a way to get high resolution, which means you need an active matrix panel. So that was invented in 2001. So in that time period, active matrix panels were rare and expensive. They were just really coming on board. And again, for those of you who need recollection, so it's basically a sheet of glass with an array of thin film transistors, and you can control each individual switch. So that's how you achieve a high resolution display today. Okay. So display makers were unwilling to provide these rare and expensive backplanes to a startup company just to build a prototype for an unproven market. I can't tell you how many times people said, no, e-paper, what's that? How many hundreds of thousands you promised to buy? So basically a lot of negativity. But IBM Research in Watson actually had a fab. They were doing research in displays. and they were able to provide us a couple panels. In fact, the interaction I had was with their manager, said, well, I can't send you anything specific, you know, designed just for you, but if you want, I can pull a couple panels out of the trash and send them to you. And I go, how bad are they? He says, 2-3 pixels out. So it was fine. So next day, these things show up, we laminate our front plane, and then we actually have this working high-resolution display. As an aside, we had a collaboration with Bell Labs. So we made the first all-printed display using organic semiconductors. So it's actually some relatively well-known people, John Rogers, Jinan Bao, were our collaborators on that. It was only commercialized actually in 2024, so 22 years later, by, there's a company in the UK called FlexEnable that is now providing backplanes, and there's actually some organic transistor e-paper displays on the market. But at the time, it generated a lot of interest, and actually we had a very, that's me. Oh, yes. So, there we go. Thank you so much. Okay. So anyway, so now we've got an active matrix panel, time to make a product. So Sony stepped up and said, we're going to make an e-reader, the Sony Libre. It was introduced in Japan in 2004. The good news is that it had the 6-inch active matrix display. It's a great display, reasonably priced, about $400. However, you could not upload your own content. You could only rent items from the Sony store, and they erased itself after 60 days. And there were only about 400 titles in the store. So needless to say, great display, not so good product. So I really like this quote at the bottom from this blog Gizmodo. All this makes the Libre a breakthrough device as soon as some Swedish hacker unlocks the DRM that prevents us from putting our own media on it. So several generations of the Sony reader were fabricated, but they never caught on, and then that was they were discontinued, which is not good for, again, for a startup company trying to develop its first product and trying to stay afloat. Luckily, Amazon Kindle came along. This is the first successful product, introduced in 2007. The screen was more or less the same as the Libre. I mean, there were some improvements, but basically it's a 6-inch active matrix panel. But you had the Amazon bookstore. They made it easy to purchase and download content and effective marketing. So thanks to Harold for reminding me, Oprah was plugging the Kindle, in fact, drove a lot of the early sales. Okay? So that fueled the growth of the company. E-Ink was eventually acquired by a Taiwanese company called Prime View International, and now they're a $1 billion company. Go figure. So, summary and lessons learned. If you're going to be taking technology out of the lab, just figure that there's going to be a number of things that you don't appreciate that are going to have to be invented in order to really commercialize the technology. In our case, the industry was really skeptical about even the need for electronic paper. Digital signage was never a great market at that time, and the Sony e-reader did nothing to change minds. But timing is everything. Active matrix panels for LCDs came along, and they could be repurposed for electronic paper. That was only possible in the late 2000s and beyond. Amazon decided to bet on a still unproven technology to launch their new product category. And again, kind of a we can figure it out leap of faith was kind of built into the company. So with that, and then this talk is part of a chapter. So if you're interested in electronic paper, there's a nice book that came out a couple years ago on e-paper displays, printed by SID and Wiley, and I've got a chapter on that. So thank you for your attention.
Very interesting talk. So, questions?
So really nice talk. So you have all this advantage from experience, and now we're getting together here to talk about kind of like a new field, right? So talking about all sorts of crazy ideas. Did you have any advice, sort of like looking forward into the field of AR?
So one of my venture capital people on the board of one of the venture-backed companies I worked on said, scars like mine are hard to find. So in fact, there are lots of lessons learned. I think one thing that should recognize is solving a problem is much better than inventing some cool technology and then trying to figure out what you're going to do with it. So just keeping in mind, developing the technology itself is hard enough, but then what's the application set? And just be brutally honest with yourself that, we can talk ourselves out, e-paper is going to be great, but no one knew what e-paper was, right? Until Amazon came along and actually decided that.
That's a remarkable.
Yeah, yeah. Oh no, it's everywhere now. It's an established category.